Hello and welcome to the Internet of Things Made Simple. I'm Larry Bohumer. This is episode number 9, and I thank you for joining us. As always, I ask you to look at our new webpage, theinternetofthingsmadesimple.com, as it has some great material on IoT. I also ask you to subscribe to this podcast using your favorite podcast service. In our main topic tonight, we're going to cover how IoT is changing lives in cities and in some rural areas by making them more efficient and by offering better levels of service to the residents. To open, we're going to start talking about something that seems like it comes right out of a Terminator film, and that's killer robots. We do have a line of ebooks on iBooks, which I definitely recommend you look at, and one of them is on military. In that ebook, we open by talking about how many of the inventions that we use today were either done for or by the US military. So the military is not new to the world of technology. Knowing that, it shouldn't surprise anyone. They're looking at using AI and automation to improve their overall efficiency and to protect the lives of their soldiers. A company in Estonia has developed a robot that uses technology to effectively replace a human soldier. The robot moves on tank-like treads and can be equipped with various firearms as needed. Equally important, however, is that the device or the robot uses advanced algorithms and AI to determine the correct course of action, often in milliseconds, which is much faster than a human can do it, and also doesn't factor in any kind of emotion. For now, the system is controlled by humans at the helm, but it does bring up the question of whether similar systems should be used. It's a question we have to answer soon because 5 countries are now either working on late-stage projects or are using weapons that have autonomous capabilities. So as we advance in AI, computing power, and IoT, it makes it more likely that we're going to have an autonomous soldier. And that's something we have to consider, and we have to weigh the effects. When we come back from a short break, we're going to talk about how IoT is enabling the smart city. Back in 5 seconds. Okay, welcome back. Despite what a lot of people think, I've always thought that working for the government was not one of the easier jobs. Sure, you might have some job security that other people might not have and benefits and those kind of things, but most people have pretty high expectations for the services they get from the government. But unlike a lot of things, they hate paying for it. They hate paying a single dollar in tax, which is obviously what's needed to fund it. So that means that governments, especially cities though, need to use technology to become more efficient, and that allows them to offer a higher level of service. As a general overview, many cities are using things like sensors, which we're going to cover how they're using it in a bit, as well as in-vehicle communication, and now increasingly they're using AI to help them do this. In this podcast, we're going to cover a few different examples of how this is being done in different areas of municipalities. And I do want to point out that you might live in a small city, 50,000 people. You might live in a huge metropolis somewhere. The overall concept of these solutions does not change that much. If you have to do things like clear snow or, maintain parks, it doesn't matter how many roads you have to use these solutions, because there are solutions that scale very well, depending on the size of the community they're being used in. The first area we're going to talk about is in streetlights. And it's something that people often overlook because you really only notice or pay attention to streetlights when they're not working as designed. So either they're not on at all, they've burnt out, or they haven't come on, or perhaps they're not quite as bright as they should be. It has a dual effect on a city if they're not working as they should. One, it does increase the chance of things like slippage because people can't see ice and things like that. But it also has a huge effect on safety. They've shown many studies that crime goes up dramatically in areas that streetlights aren't maintained. So because of that, cities are starting to use different technologies, whether it's a LoRa network and all the devices connect to one network, but other ones are starting to use different things like Bluetooth and radio to connect to important streetlights to be able to see how they're doing. This also helps them to better schedule maintenance to know what areas are having more outages than others. The other thing it's doing is that some cities are starting to use streetlights as hotspots. No, you can't stand underneath the streetlight and browse YouTube, because you're not actually the audience they're aiming at. They're going after other devices. So as an example, the city might own some assets in your neighborhood, a fire hydrant or an electric box. They're using these streetlights as hotspots to be able to communicate to all devices, say within 100 yards or 100 meters of a streetlight. So it's kind of interesting. Similar to streetlights, another area that we often don't think about, but it's very important to a city, are traffic systems, normally in the form of traffic lights and other ones. Cities have been using a different form of IoT for decades now. It just wasn't on the internet. And that's those big hoses you might have seen going across your street. I know as kids, we used to aim our bikes at them to try to think that we could be counted as a car. It was counting the amount of traffic going by a certain spot. And that could have been for a few reasons. Maybe they wanted to know if they had to widen a street. Maybe they wanted to know if they had to change the priority of the lights. That was all done manually. Now, cities are using much more advanced systems, and these are all using sensors. And this could be in the form of sensors built into the road. It could be a roadside sensor that's keeping track of how many cars go by. It does it a number of different ways. And that's to help the cities, as I mentioned, with traffic patterns, but it's also increasingly being used for road conditions. So if you're in an area that's prone to things like mudslides, ice storms, major rainstorms, the cities are using these sensors to be able to say, you may not want to use this road, and how about I start using an AI solution to divert traffic to a different area? Depending on where you live, if you live near a freeway or a highway, you might notice that when you go to get onto the highway first thing in the morning, you get a big red light saying, do not go on. And they're using time systems. The idea is kind of simple that if people don't get on quite as fast, maybe there won't be as much traffic on the freeway. However, it didn't always factor in some important things, like maybe today is a bit heavier than normal, maybe it's a bit lighter, it's a holiday. They just used preset schedules. AI is helping them out with this. It's now allowing them to make changes to make a possible stop getting onto the on-ramp much longer, with the theory being that it will speed up traffic for everybody else. Finally, in some parts of the world, what they're doing is the hourglass mechanism, or hourglass theory as I call it. For those of you who ever tried to put sand through an hourglass, you know that if you just try to dump all the sand at once, it generally gets clogged up and doesn't flow all that well. The optimal way to fill up an hourglass is to go with a nice steady stream. So what countries, I know Norway's doing it and some other places over in Western Europe, is that if they see an accident, say up ahead, they'll start slowing down traffic, maybe 2 kilometers or 3 kilometers or 10 kilometers or a few miles for my American friends in advance. They're thinking that if you slow traffic from getting into the hourglass or the accident site, it's going to allow traffic to go faster for everyone. So these are definitely things that are moving forward pretty quickly. Next, we're going to go on to parking. And let's face it, if you live in a big city, I'm not sure there's much better in life than a free spot right in front of what you want to get to in a downtown core. Obviously, your child being born is a little better, and I guess probably your wedding day if you're married, but not much. Let's face it, there's just that euphoria that you get when you get a great parking spot. Frustrated by this, many drivers are just starting to park illegally. And that actually makes things worse when you're parking in no parking areas. Because as much as a pain as it might be, a lot of times those no parking areas are to keep traffic flowing, and a car there does slow it down for everyone. One of the problems with that, though, is that cities often relied on people to call in if someone was parking where they're not supposed to, and that slowed down the response time. They're now starting to use sensors to help them be notified if somebody is parked illegally right away, and this will help to speed up the flow of traffic. However, more importantly, as opposed to just being punitive, cities are starting to use automated systems that use things like smartphone apps and the GPS from your smartphone to help direct you towards a legal parking space, preferably one that they own and can get revenue from. So if you're in an area, you can use a voice command if you're driving, or if you're stopped, you can go into the app and you can say, find me a parking space near whatever the address is. The system will find you the closest parking spot. And in some cases, we'll even change the light above to tell people that it's been booked, and it will give you, say, 5 or 10 minutes to get there. This allows you to get to your parking space much easier. This is also starting to be used in places like the mall when you're driving around and you can see the different indicator lights, green being for an open space and red being for occupied one, that allows for traffic to move much better in parking lots. Finally, cellular communication combined with solar power has been used for a while by some forward-thinking municipalities to move those portable parking stations. Those are the ones that you go up to and put your credit card in and gives you a little ticket. One of the limitations always is that they were fixed. So if you had a temporary event, like say a concert or a carnival or something going on in an area that normally wasn't used for that, parking could be quite difficult. Cities are now starting to move these machines to where the area they need to. Because they're powered by solar and the connectivity is by cellular, they can be set up in minutes. This not only improves parking for these events, but it also helps to increase the revenue for the city. Finally, before we go to break, we're going to talk about how it's helping water and wastewater. For this, I'm assuming that your city or your region has some kind of an involvement in delivering water to your home and disposing of the wastewater from your home. These systems are often terribly old, I mean decades old. And when you think about it, it's kind of amazing that we don't have more issues when it comes to things like sinkholes and pipe burst, because many of these pipes are now a decade or two past how long engineers thought they would last for in the first place. Knowing that you can't replace the entire system at once, cities are starting to use sensors to look after issues to be able to determine what has to be fixed first and what can wait. This is used for water delivery, but as well as for wastewater. And this is going to help to prevent things like major pipe burst and, equally important, those nasty sinkholes that you see. Finally, depending on where you live, flooding might be an issue. I'm going to talk a little bit later about what happened in the city of Calgary in 2013. It's still, over 5 years later, is still amazing to the residents, the amount of damage that a flood could cause. Obviously, depending on how close you are to a river and different environmental issues, you might not be able to prevent a flood, but at least you can start to monitor it better. And cities are starting to use things like dry ponds to be able to handle the overflow during a flood. However, these dry ponds, like in the case of Calgary, are often used as kids' play areas or soccer fields when they're not being used as a dry pond. So in the event of a major rainstorm, they need to know, are people in the dry pond, and how do they alert people to get out of the area in case these areas were overflood. And in this scenario, they're using sensors and different alerts to do that. And it tends to work pretty well. When we come back from a short break, we're going to talk about things like how IoT is helping make your parks and recreation experience better, how it's helping to control air pollution, and how it's helping to get rid of something we often don't think about, that being your garbage. Back in 5 seconds. One of the things that many people factor in when they're asked about the quality of life in an area is the number of parks and the availability of recreational facilities for people to use. And it kind of makes sense. If you want to keep people healthy, you want to have places that encourages them to exercise. And that could be a park, it could be a trail system, it could be at different facilities. These things keep people healthier and safer. One issue that cities have is they need to determine where to spend the money when it comes to parks. They need to know how many people use this path, and should I spend money making the path wider here, or should I put another path in over here? They're doing this using things that you wear on your wrist, and that's namely smartphones, but sometimes smartwatch data as well. Don't worry, they don't know it's you. So if you decide to go out on a bike ride or a run or a walk, and you log that event using GPS in one of these apps, that information can be put together so that they can have an overall citywide view. So if a city can know that 4,000 people use this trail every week, I better make sure it's clear of debris and snow, whereas many people are walking and running in this particular area, but there is no path there. Perhaps this should be an area of expansion for a path for us. As well, one of the things with parks is that they want to welcome everyone, but there are some creatures they do not want to welcome, and that could be some of the predators. Depending on the area that you live, you might be close enough to a ravine or to a rural area that creatures like bears and cougars and wolves are a threat to people. Cities are using sensors and AI to protect against that. And I know personally, I live very close to Fish Creek in Calgary, which is a tremendous park system. You can go for like a 30K bike ride and still be in the park. But it's not the first time that I've ever come across creatures of those kind where, I come around a corner and there's a cougar standing there. So it luckily doesn't happen often, but it can happen. So using sensors to warn people makes a lot of sense. The next part is kind of related. If you want people to exercise outside, you better give them clean air to breathe. And one of the issues when you put together 500,000 or 8 million people into one area is air pollution. It can be worse depending on the geography. So if your area is more prone to it, or even the time of year, as it heats up in the summertime, you find that pollution gets a little worse. It can be an issue for people, as well as it can be an issue for people with allergies like myself. Cities are helping out in two ways. One, they're using advanced particle detectors, which gives them much more information and much more frequent information than they ever had before. They're now able to see what different levels and how it's affected and how wind patterns might affect pollution levels, and they can see what they can do. Some areas, as an example, are saying that it tends to be worse in a certain time period of the year, so they might even restrict the factory usage in that time period. The other way they're doing it is very similar to how they find out who's using the parks, is that they're using information from smart masks. I actually hadn't heard of this before until I did some research on this, but these are masks that people wear that will help tell them what the pollution level is. Maybe they're prone to issues with their lungs or allergies, and these masks will help to tell them what's going on in the area. Similar, as I mentioned, to the parks, they can conglomerate or put that information together in one big bundle, so they can know that in this particular region or this particular area, there's issues with air quality. It also does things like atmospheric pressure and even UV rates as well. The third one we're going to talk about in this segment is something that most of us kind of take for granted, but we probably should pay more attention to, and that's garbage. It was one of the areas that, believe it or not, saw most of the earliest inventions of IoT, and that has made a huge difference. And that's including things like smart bins. And in case you're wondering, what's a smart bin? How could a garbage bin be smart? These bins have different technologies on them. Some of them use solar to be able to power it without having to wire it. Most of them use cellular technology, although it could use Bluetooth or LoRa and other networks. This allows them to signal to city members and employees that they're now at 50%, 70%, or 90% full, allowing them to better schedule the pickups. This does a couple things. One, obviously, it reduces the number of pickups that are done unnecessarily for these bins. But depending on where you are, if you're in a beautiful area, like I know just west of Calgary here in the town of Banff, which is one of the prettiest places on the planet, one of the last things you want to see in your pictures if you're visiting is a garbage truck. Not that there's anything wrong with that, it's just kind of defeats the purpose. So by having these pickups better scheduled, they can make sure that the city stays pretty and very picturesque that way. The other thing they're starting to do has to do with security. And I never really thought of a garbage bin as being part of a security solution before. But when I was doing some background information for the book, I found out that a lot of the illegal activity that happens in urban centers, especially downtown, tends to happen behind garbage bins because they use it as a bit of a shield. So in order to improve the security level of downtown, what they're starting to do is to remove some of these bins. However, that does mean you're going to have a potential overflow of garbage. So by using smart bins, they can better schedule pickup. So that way you need less bins there. And that tends to make things more secure. In terms of disaster recovery, which is our final topic, I did want to tell the story about the city of Calgary for those who aren't aware. So I was flying back from San Francisco and I really wasn't paying attention to the news. I had heard it was raining pretty hard in Calgary, but didn't actually pay attention to what was going on. What's the big deal about rain? And all of a sudden, when we were coming close to landing, we started hearing some kerfuffle and oohs and ahs on the other side of the plane. And that's when a few of us snuck over and took a look at it. We just couldn't believe it. the entire downtown core of Calgary was under several feet of water. And in fact, the story that they tell is that the Saddle Dome, which is the hockey arena, if you were now ever visiting there and sitting in the first, I believe it's 8 rows by the ice, you actually would have been underwater during this. So it was kind of amazing to me. And I think most residents believe that the city did a great job based on the tools they had. But I'm glad to see that they didn't just sit back and say, okay, we did a good job. Maybe we'll do better next time. They actually started to put in solutions. And the first thing they're doing is putting in sensors everywhere. So the earlier you can have detection, the more you can warn people, the more you can open up different drain areas, the more you can put in sandbags. It just gives you more time. And I think that's the first thing that cities need to do, is to give people more warnings. Obviously, in the event of things like an earthquake, there's really only so much time you have, but the more time you have, the better. The other thing they're doing as well is they're improving communication with their team, and that's through use of mobile solutions. So whether it be command posts that have cellular, so they can be up and running in a matter of seconds or minutes, perhaps they're using more in-vehicle communications. These are all very helpful. The last thing they're doing is what a lot of cities are doing, is starting to use much more GPS systems. So they're able to tell where all the key vehicles are. So as an example, in the event of evacuations, they can know where all the buses are and be able to use buses as evacuations. There really is no way you can ever prevent a disaster at a city level or, a state or a province level or even a national level. But the more information that we can get is better. And I do want to give a bit of a shout out, one final one, to the city of Calgary, as they are putting in what's called a LoRa network, or a long-range radio network. And this is going to help to communicate, and I think it's a great move on their part. I do want to point out that I didn't touch on first responders, so police, EMS, and fire, because we're going to go into much more detail in a future podcast covering how IoT solutions are helping these brave men and women keep us all safe. I do thank you for joining today. I look forward to having you join future podcasts. I also welcome all the new listeners we've had over the last few weeks and recommend that you listen to some of our back catalog, because we have some great podcasts, including things like how CAT-M and eventually NB-IoT are going to drive IoT growth and not 5G, whether you should build, buy, or integrate connectivity into your solution, and a bit of a network selection guide covering the 9 or 10 different ways you can connect a device. And we go over a bit of pros and cons on each. Thanks again for listening. I'm Larry Humor. Take care.